The gap between institutional confinement and independent community living is vast. Moving from a locked ward to an apartment requires bridging two entirely different realities. In Illinois, this move is not elective. The Williams and Colbert consent decrees legally force the state to transition eligible adults out of nursing homes and mental health facilities and into integrated communities. Common misconceptions frame this transition as a matter of morale, a process of encouraging patients and boosting their self-esteem until they feel ready to live on their own. This state document shows the actual framework for the transition program, a massive $50 million managed logistics pipeline. That budget is strictly divided, allocating $29.5 million to the Colbert class and $20.5 million to the Williams class. Rebuilding a human life requires a specific alignment. The humanistic philosophy of patient recovery must be welded directly to rigid administrative tools and protective technology. Operationalizing human dignity requires an uncompromising end-to-end systems engineering approach rather than relying on good intentions alone. Traditional institutional care often responds to a patient's lack of motivation by trying to boost global self-esteem. They treat a performance gap as a morale problem. This framework outlines a diagnostic shift towards self-efficacy, a specific cognitive calculation of an individual's capacity to orchestrate resources for a task. Adjusting this requires diagnosing precise attributions holding a patient back. We map these factors on an intervention matrix: internal versus external, stable versus variable. The transition program forces this calculation through a rigid 12-step autonomy blueprint. It shifts the resident from a passive recipient of care to an active architect of their new life through engineered constraints. Consider the funding requisition for their new apartment. The program explicitly bans the use of standard, pre-filled item templates. Giving the resident a blank slate forces them to brainstorm and justify their own specific needs, down to adaptive cooking utensils. This custom assessment actively rebuilds their orchestration capacity. The same logic applies to housing searches. Instead of relying on digital maps, transition coordinators mandate physical, shoe-leather apartment viewings to force the patient to confront real-world environmental constraints, like sidewalk access for a wheelchair. This targets a specific psychological mechanism. Attributing failure to a stable, internal trait like innate talent causes efficacy to crash permanently. Rerouting that attribution to variable effort allows confidence to remain resilient. True behavioral change requires breaking institutional inertia. Confidence is treated as a raw mathematical calculation that must be actively trained, not a mood to be lifted. Parallel to the patient's internal shift, the state must deploy a massive external apparatus to fund and execute the physical move. This Illinois Transition Pipeline document maps out the state's end-to-end de-risking protocol. It is engineered to preempt 4 primary external failure points: housing affordability, physical setup, medical coverage, and long-term stability. The initial financial setup carries a critical trap regarding federal asset limits. Most transitioning residents rely on supplemental security income. If the state simply handed them a $2,800 check to cover move-in costs, it would violate the program's $2,000 asset limit and immediately strip them of their monthly benefits. To bypass this, state staff act as a managed logistics service, deploying funds directly to landlords so residents never touch cash. For long-term housing, a permanent bridge subsidy fixes rent at exactly 30% of the individual's income, while the state covers the balance. The next logistical threat is ensuring continuous access to clinical support and life-saving medication. Care managers execute a proactive workflow to track daily medical expenses. They ensure Medicaid spend-down deductibles are paid directly to the state by the 20th of every month, guaranteeing coverage never lapses. Financial and logistical stability do not naturally occur just because a patient signs a lease. They are mandatory, engineered foundations required to ensure clinical oversight continues without interruption. To understand why these strict transition protocols exist, we have to look back at the environment the patient is leaving, the specialized mental health rehabilitation facility. Inside these facilities, conditions are often chaotic. Humanistic clinical goals are constantly derailed by intense administrative panic and regulatory pressures. This creates a toxic systemic failure known as paper QAPI, quality assurance and performance improvement, that exists purely as a robotic documentation burden to appease state surveyors rather than to improve patient care. The result is goal displacement. Panicked administrators, desperate for census numbers to satisfy state audits, physically interrupt group therapy sessions to harass clinicians for data. Introducing technology into this environment requires it to be framed as a tool for staff support, rather than a top-down efficiency overlord. The DT502 AI automation layer serves a completely different purpose. It acts as an impenetrable protective shield for clinical time. The AI boundary absorbs the administrative burden, intercepting data requests and instantly generating the required compliance metrics. Because administrators now have automated dashboard access to their metrics, they no longer need to walk onto the floor. Clinicians buy back hours of their day. In behavioral healthcare, the value of the AI layer lies in building a digital wall that protects the time required for humans to execute evidence-based interventions. Following the move-in date, an 18-month monitoring period begins. The rigid schedule of weekly in-person visits slowly tapers down to basic monthly check-ins as the individual stabilizes. A decentralized community safety net replaces the centralized institution. Individuals gain access to peer-run warm lines and non-clinical living rooms, offering calm spaces to de-escalate crises and avert emergency room admissions. Then comes the month 19th test. This is the critical precipice where the intense state monitoring recedes and the grants stop hovering over the individual. The entire transition program builds toward one open question: how does a carefully monitored, resource-rich logistical pipeline finally mature into self-sustaining behavior? The $50 million logistical engine, the psychological rewiring, and the AI facility shields are all exclusively built to facilitate this single moment of obsolescence. True independence occurs in the quiet moment, when a heavily engineered state operation dissolves into a normal, mundane life, owned entirely by the individual.